here, and I'm impressed with Luca's memory of biographical details and specifics. I think I have 3 prior remarks to make. The first one is the cover slide is in English, but the rest of my slides is in German, and that's due to an amazingly stupid misunderstanding as to the language of the Academy. I will deliver the presentation in English, however, the share of non-native speakers amongst you won't fully get the content of the slides. My apologies, that's just my mistake. Secondly, as you've heard from my bio, I am not an economist, so I will introduce some key concepts, but this is probably rather a political take on the issue of carbon pricing, and I've forgotten my third prior remark, and we'll simply get right into the topic. Yes, that was about questions for clarification, so I've understood that in principle this is meant to be a lecture followed by a Q&A and discussion, hopefully a lively one. But if there is parts of concept or things where you immediately like, okay, I don't understand this and it's important for going on and probably understanding the rest, do raise your hands and I'm happy to interrupt my presentation. All right, well, let's get started. Put a price on carbon and save the climate. Indeed, carbon pricing is in the news big time at the moment, at least in Germany. And I will argue in the following 45 minutes has quite an important role to play if we are to save our climate or address climate change in a meaningful and effective manner. Indeed, what is the International Carbon Action Partnership? Lucas has actually explained it quite well. It's essentially a network or forum of 36 governments from 4 continents, and both subnational and national governments from New Zealand to Korea, to California, to Kazakhstan, to the city of Tokyo, that all are interested or have emissions trading systems in place and want to learn from one another and exchange best practices and experiences. Learn from experiences, both good and bad. And one long-term goal of emissions trading has always been the linking of systems, and ICAP is also meant to prepare the alignment of system designs with that long-term vision of building a global carbon market. And we're doing that through these 3 pillars. And you may have seen in my affiliation, I also have a second bracket there, that's Adelphi, because the ICAP Secretariat is hosted by the Berlin-based think tank Adelphi, which is doing much broader work on climate and environment. So I'm not just talking about emissions trading here. Some of my points are also probably more opinions than I would be allowed as an intergovernmental secretariat, so I'm always kind of changing my hats here a little bit. All right, what am I going to talk to you about today? First of all, CO2 pricing, the basics, then a glance at where are we at with carbon pricing worldwide. Then, since I had been assuming this was a largely German or only German audience, I wanted to say a few words about the German CO2 price debate. And then my last one is a little bit provocative. Does the CO2 price alone save the climate? Well, first of all, just one slide. There's, I think, many ways of presenting this, but addressing climate change is incredibly urgent. And there's just a couple of examples here, also from a recent high-level report. If we have unmitigated climate change, this threatens every aspect of development, is very likely to induce large-scale climate migration, worsening of conflicts, both in severity, durability, and conflicts that just arise because of climate change, threatens the prosperity of countries, both in the global north and in the global south. And the recognition of the global extent of that problem led to the agreement, the Paris Agreement that was concluded in 2015. I think that was a big relief to parts of the climate community that the world had come together in one agreement and agreed to effectively address climate change. I think what we'll also be discussing tonight is that implementation of that agreement still leaves wanting. But we have a global agreement and we have a 2-degree target, a target to keep climate change under 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century that provides a meaningful, at least something to measure progress on climate action in the world against. And there's again also plenty of different ways to say, well, how far have we gotten and what's still left to do? These 3 bars show the climate budget. The green one is one calculation that shows the remaining CO2 budget in order to remain in a 2-degree compatible emissions pathway. So here on the y-axis you have the gigatons of emissions. So that's what we roughly still have available. And then if you look at the blue bar, this is the CO2 budget that's made up by the so-called climate commitments, the nationally determined contributions. that the members of the Paris Agreement have made so far for the period 2016 to 2030. So you already see between green and blue there isn't a whole lot left. And then just another metric to compare that with, this is the gray, dark gray and light gray budget, is the budget that's eaten up by all existing dark gray and planned coal-fired power plants worldwide. So we really have to engage in a very meaningful energy transition, phasing out coal, not building new coal, and we have to do a whole lot of other things, and the carbon price is pretty important for that.
Sorry, could you explain climate budget or carbon budget?
The carbon budget is the idea of that if we want to reach a certain temperature target, we only have a certain amount of gigatons of CO2 equivalent that we are still allowed to emit, and that's the climate budget. Exactly, and at the same time, pricing a negative commodity, CO2 pricing, is something that's a little bit weird, and that's sometimes hard to grasp, and that, it's not an immediately very intuitive concept. And here's just a couple of headlines that show that this bit has been in the news, and at least looking at the German media, there would be plenty more headlines from the last weeks and months. So why CO2 pricing? First of all, by implementing a carbon price, you're using market forces rather than regulating against them. So you're using the discovery and selection mechanism of this instrument. Carbon pricing creates an incentive, but at the same time provides flexibility to actors how they want to react to that incentive. Because they have the possibility, in the case of the carbon tax, to either pay the tax or reduce. In the case of the emissions trading system, they even have more different options, and we'll get to that. Thirdly, that greater flexibility, that's one of the key arguments why environmental economists generally like market-based instruments in carbon pricing. That greater flexibility that I just talked about leads to generally lower compliance costs. And indeed, if we are to get to a meaningful degree of climate action, we need to make sure that we reach those targets cost efficiently. And finally, there's the phenomenon of information asymmetry. The regulator, in the case of carbon pricing, does not need to know everything about abatement potentials, abatement costs, etc., but can let the market figure these things out, at least in theory. And here we are still within the environmental economics theory. In theory, a carbon price can send a price signal to the whole economy. It can provide an incentive for less CO2 intensive production. It can provide an incentive for less CO2 intensive consumption. It can steer investments towards lower carbon content, as the higher carbon content provides less return. The higher carbon investments provide less returns once you have a CO2 price in place. And last but not least, and that's probably the most doubtful or debatable one, it can, if a carbon price is meaningful enough and high enough, it can provide an incentive for innovation to develop new low-carbon processes, products, and technologies. So now I quickly want to introduce the two key kind of prototypes of carbon pricing instruments. First of all, we have emissions trading here, which is a quantity-based instrument where the regulator sets the cap, the emissions limit that's allowed across the covered entities, and the CO2 price then emerges as a function of the demand for allowances among participating entities and what's available in terms of supply. So you have a fixed allowance supply and allowance demand, varies based on various factors, which I have in the gray box on the side. Depends on how our emissions developing, what are the marginal abatement costs, what expectations do market actors have of the future carbon price, commodity prices, and technological change. And if I were to summarize in a nutshell, the key challenge in implementing emissions trading systems, and we're going to get back to that later, is how do you set that cap? And I mean, I think for most of you, probably the European emissions trading system is the most kind of example that comes to mind. By setting this cap, an ever-increasing amount of carbon budget, you're providing a long-term, very visible investment signal to covered entities. How much are we as a whole allowed to reduce? This is what's left. So when do I make my investments in lower carbon technologies? How do I design my corporate strategy? But at the same time, you have this long-term projection, the cap, but you need to account for fluctuations and external shocks. And the European emissions trading system was faced with the financial crisis in 2008, which led to a very steep drop in emissions, which we're still dealing the aftermath with, because the demand for allowances, given the much lower emissions due to the economic downturn, has been settling in the system ever since. It has been stayed in the system, and regulators are trying to get it out, but we're still having excess of allowances in the European ETS. And that's precisely to do with the fact we made a long-term bet on how that trajectory will look like, and reality turned out a little bit afterward differently. And that's also why all newer emissions trading systems, including now the EU ETS, actually have market stability instruments in place that provide more certainty, or that provide for the flexibility to adjust the cap if unforeseen events happen. In the case of the EU, that's the market stability reserve. In the case of other systems, those are price collars, where you have a maximum price and a minimum price within which the market price is allowed to vary. So it's no longer the pure economic theory, it's just supply and demand. And one more slide on how does emissions trading work, because it can sometimes be a little bit of a tricky concept. Essentially, as I said, you have an overall cap for the covered sectors, which then is broken down in individual allocations to covered entities, so in this case, to industrial plants. And then we have a plan that has cheap abatement options that reduces more and has allowances left over. We have another entity that maybe doesn't act so quickly, has higher abatement costs, and can buy those leftover allowances from the lower cost entity. So we have then two directional flows or many directional flows of I'm selling certificates, I'm making money with this, I'm buying certificates, and thereby subsidizing cheaper cost investment abatement options elsewhere. And that's the case, what we're mostly dealing with in ICAP, and the key use of the instrument nowadays is that trade between companies or between industrial installations. And then, because a lot of people often confuse this, we also have international emissions trading, which was part of the Kyoto Protocol, where states were allowed to trade with one another under their overall climate target. So if one country had achieved their target easily, they could sell their excess emission reductions to another country. That possibility is still given in the Paris Agreement, but is, for various reasons, not very prominent and less likely to be used. We can also touch on that in the discussion if you want. Then we have the CO2 tax on the other side. Much easier to imagine. The government sets a carbon tax rate, which is the CO2 price, and the real emissions that result from that are uncertain ex ante. They are a combination of the strength of that price signal and various other factors, which are the same ones as the ones in the gray box on the previous slide. So here we're fixing the price, and what is unclear is demand or emissions. So far, so mostly clear, I assume, since you're all economists as opposed to me. All right, and exactly then the key critical question for a carbon tax is, what tax rate do you set such that companies are not just paying the price, that is an additional cost for them, but that it actually introduces behavioral change and thus ultimately leads to reduced emissions. And then I have a beautiful comparison table here that's quite quick and dirty, but just to give an idea, okay, if we are comparing those two instruments against one another, the first bar, the ETS, that's one key advantage, provides certainty over the emissions in the system. It sets the overall limit, so it makes sure that climate targets are reached, which the tax doesn't do, as I just said. On the other hand, in the ETS, you don't know what the price will be, because that's a function of market forces, which you do know in the carbon tax. So some people also argue that that's more visible to entities, and if you have an increasing tax trajectory, that may actually lead to, it's easier for companies that are not constantly trading in commodity markets to just realize what that means for them. In our discussions in the context of ICAP, we sometimes get the sense that countries think it is politically easier to introduce an emissions trading system rather than a tax, because it provides more flexibility to companies, and it also provides the flexibility to profit if you're reducing cheaply and can sell allowances to others, and because it's not a fiscal instrument, and fiscal instruments are often more difficult to introduce. That's actually also the reason why the European emissions trading system came into existence. There were several attempts to introduce a carbon tax in the EU in the 1990s. This always failed, and ultimately the EU ETS was the way to get a Euro-wide climate instrument in place. At the same time, it's a little bit out, and the difference in political feasibility, I would say, is in the end not so big. What is clear is that an ETS is somewhat administratively more complex because you also need a trading platform. You need to make sure that trades and allowances are protected from fraud and manipulation. You need to make sure that you have enough actors in the market, etc. But actually, that difference isn't so big as it's often made out to be. I'll leave the carbon leakage protection, that's too complicated. Last but not least, you can link ETS and you can create bigger markets, which is not possible in the case of carbon taxes, which theoretically we could coordinate, but that's just much harder. And with this, we're getting to carbon pricing worldwide. Just a few key numbers. What I didn't put into my 3 worldwide trend slides is the growth. Overall, carbon pricing initiatives worldwide are increasing quite massively, because countries do need to think about how to meet their climate targets, and carbon pricing is that efficient tool. Yet we still only have 20% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide priced, and many of them at a very low price, as you see in the $1 to $27 per ton of CO2. Many of them are not priced at a level that really induces behavioral change. And there's also quite a significant amount of revenue that's been raised from carbon pricing systems over the past year, which then can be put to additional good uses in one way or another. CO2 pricing worldwide, there's plenty of colors on this graphic, essentially distinguishing by instrument and introduction status. I think what's relevant to take away is that you actually have pricing going on in different regions. We started out in Europe and North America. Australia, I would actually argue, doesn't have a meaningful carbon pricing system, but the World Bank sees this differently. And we have Latin America as a particularly dynamic region where several governments are working to introduce carbon pricing instruments. And for ICAP, the big thing to watch is China's efforts trying to introduce a national ETS, because that industry and energy sector alone is so big in terms of emissions that it's actually also a litmus test for the instrument. If it manages to work there, this will be great. If it doesn't, this will be a real issue. And that's meant to be started next year. Let's see. I have one slide. Basically you could talk about all of this for a long time. Just one example on, well, is carbon pricing effective in terms of reducing emissions? Well, that really, really depends on the design and the stringency. And I've here taken the poster child, the Swedish carbon tax, which started incredibly early. You see the whole timeline here started in 1990 and then was regularly ratcheted up. You see the price levels increasing over time up to 120 euros per ton of CO2. And you also see that initially for industry this was significantly lower to provide protection against carbon leakage, so production moving elsewhere, but has now also been aligned and is at a similarly high level. So the world's oldest and most meaningful carbon price worldwide. What are the success factors here? We did a study on that. Well, you started low, but they gradually ratcheted up over time, also in quite a visible manner, so that companies could plan with that. They announced those changes early, and they compensated it with lowering other taxes. So the overall tax base did not increase, but it was a shift from taxing the goods to taxing the bads, income and energy, exactly. And then that's the graphic that the Swedes always like to show, that how did the economy and greenhouse gas emissions develop over the last 30 years. And this is not just the carbon tax, but the carbon tax was a core driver behind it. While the economy grew by 78%, while emissions decreased by 26%. So that's actually quite a meaningful example showing a decoupling of economic growth from emissions. So really kind of a proof of concept. But of course, this was in a Nordic state with a strong, broad-based support for climate change. So there's plenty of factors that have made this easier than in other cases. Well, is CO2 pricing effective? The other example is the EU ETS, and this is a graphic that's a little bit more complicated to read. Essentially, what you should look at are the red emissions, which are the emissions under the ETS, and the red line, which is the ETS cap. And that's precisely, perhaps this actually provides, let's see. No, it doesn't. You see precisely here a very meaningful drop in emissions from the economic crisis. And essentially from this point onwards, you see that emissions stayed under the cap for quite a while. So actually there has not been a real emissions constraint through the EU ETS, and instead we have been building up a surplus base of allowances over time. That said, the EU ETS has still had a meaningful effect, I would argue, because companies know their long-term trajectory and know that the carbon budget will get ever more limited. They have been obliged to measure, verify, and report their emissions, which in themselves has kind of a disciplining effect. And okay, what are we actually emitting? So it's part of the balance books. Buying allowances is also part of the balance books. Allowances that you don't need, you can sell. So there is still an incentive, but it's much weaker than policymakers would have liked it to see. Still, you now have the first studies coming out trying to measure the effectiveness of the EU ETS over a couple of years, and actually the results are surprisingly robust and meaningful. These are mostly sample comparisons of firms that are just below the threshold of being included in the EU ETS and others that are above, and you see those that were included in the EU ETS have reduced their emissions much more. They've actually become more profitable over time. They've innovated a little bit more. So yeah, there are effects, but they are less than we would have liked to see. Well, a very abbreviated, did you want to ask something? No. A very abridged version of the German CO2 debate, and I'm happy to come back on any of the aspects above that I touched on. And for that, we first need to take a look at the European climate policy architecture, because we essentially have two blocks of emissions in the EU. We have those covered by the European emissions trading system, which is a fully harmonized instrument at European level. So it's completely blind for national targets. It's fine if German industry emits more, if in return in Spain energy production reduces its emissions because it's cheaper. That's the whole idea of the instrument, which makes up about 50% of emissions in the EU. And the second graphic below, you see the ETS price, which has been very volatile and also very, very low over a very long time frame. And actually, this is no longer, I stole this graphic from a colleague at the Öko Institute, and actually the price now, just a couple of months later, I think this presentation is from January, so the price is at $30, 30 euros, no longer 20 euros. And this actually has been very stably and steeply increasing, and that's due to quite meaningful, significant policy reforms that were enacted over the last year, and to which market actors are really responding now. So I would argue that the EU ETS isn't the perfect instrument yet, but there have been quite important steps to actually fixing it for the long term to make a real contribution to climate change. And then you have the second 50% of European emissions, which are those that are not regulated under the European emissions trading system. And that's transport, buildings, smaller industry, and services and agriculture. And this is, in the European context, this is regulated through the so-called effort sharing regulation, which mandates national targets to each member state. So Germany, under this regulation, has an overall climate target, has a target for these sectors that it needs to achieve. And in that sector, so far in Germany, we do not have any carbon pricing in place. And as the next, and there's essentially two things that are being debated at the moment. That first debate is a longer debate, is the question on, okay, right now the prices are looking much better than they looked for a long time. But in order to safeguard the system, we need a minimum price, and it's completely unfeasible that this is being introduced at the European level, because we have a number of not so climate policy key member states like Poland that would certainly block such a move. So the more politically feasible option is to do this as a coalition of the willing, of more progressive, greener EU member states. I'm not going to go more into that in detail. I would say, at least in Germany at the moment, this is being proposed, but the current government will certainly not move into that direction because it also presents various problems. And the second, much more heated debate that's going on at the moment is about, do we put a national carbon price through a carbon tax or an ETS on those non-ETS emissions, namely transport, buildings, etc. And that, essentially, we now have an agreement, we seem to have an agreement in principle that there should be a CO2 price. I mean, Angela Merkel has very clearly come out in favor of it. I don't think she has the full support of the CDU yet. But if you had asked me half a year ago if that's possible, I would have said no. But yeah, Fridays for Future, etc., have provided an impetus for the government to move significantly faster than they previously did. And yes, why is a CO2 price for these sectors important? That's if you look at emissions trends, that's actually, I didn't find a nice graphic that also looks backwards, because this graphic just looks forwards. It essentially looks at the budgets that are, according to EU regulation, allowed for Germany under the effort sharing regulation. That's the blue line. And then you have the projected emissions trend by the German government. That's the red line. And that gap here is really, really quite significant. And this is an EU regulation, and if Germany doesn't meet this, it will pay a lot of fines. There is the possibility to buy excess emission reductions from other member states, but it's very unlikely that other member states will have a lot of excess emission reductions either. And if Germany gets into non-compliance, this will get, I mean, it's reputationally, it's horrendous, and it will get really, really expensive. So this is a real money issue now that the German government needs to figure out how to fill that gap. And this is my very quick, in a nutshell, summary of the options that are currently being discussed and on the table. Essentially, the Environment Ministry came out not entirely openly, because it's actually the Finance Ministry that should make proposals in this area, in favor of enhancing the currently existing energy tax by a CO2 component. And I have to bracket this by saying that I am not the real expert in this. I'm following this debate, but please don't ask me too many specifics about emissions and policies in the buildings and transport sectors, but that's the basic logic of it. You're adding a CO2 component on an energy tax that so far has not been based on fossil fuel content. And there's also numbers that come with that, starting in 35 euros, increasing to 180 euros. That's the proposal, somewhat cautious proposal of the Environment Ministry. I would say this is quite feasible politically. It's quite easy to do also, because you're just building on an existing tax. And ultimately, where do you want to affect behavior change? That is with the consumers, that is with the people that are considering what car to buy next, how to potentially change their heating system going forward if there's an overhaul. And having that increasing price, visibly increasing price, even though I'm typically advocating emission trading systems, I would argue has significant benefits. That's also that's the first one. The second one that's been put forward by the CDU, I should actually start the other way around. Then why not an emissions trading system? And the first argument that was put forward there, well, it would be most efficient if we could include these sectors into the European emissions trading system. But I would argue, and most experts in the area agree with me on that this is completely unfeasible before 2028, 2029, 2030. Why? Because we have just agreed a big set of reforms on the EU ETS at the European level, and I don't think there will be willingness by other member states to make that step. And there's also big problems, because actually abatement costs in the energy, in the transport and the heating sector are so much higher than in the current ETS sectors, which essentially means what would happen is that all of the abatement burden over the next 10 or 15 years stays with the energy and the industry sectors, and the transport sector and the heating and so on will just do that. So it will not induce an incentive, but will provide an excuse for them to essentially not do much more, and at the same time also provide an excuse for getting rid of additional instruments. Because they can say, well, our emissions are covered under the EU ETS, why should we do anything in addition? So I would really consider this a political ruse more than anything else. Then that second, more feasible alternative is, well, if we cannot include these sectors in Germany for which we urgently need climate solutions in the European system, then why not make a national emissions trading system? And what I've written here, I think, is probably the most advanced slide or statement I'm making in my whole presentation. The easy argument is to say, well, this is administratively quite an effort, so it would be a matter of 2 or 3 years until you can introduce it, whereas the tax you could do significantly quicker. The second really important reason, however, is that if you now took this line as the cap and the budget for these sectors, that would, and then let the market do its work, that would lead to market prices, because emission reductions are so expensive in these sectors, to go into a three-figure areas very, very quickly. So there's different estimates on abatement costs in these sectors, but they are surely in the three-figure hundreds of euros. And that's, I think, politically completely unfeasible. And then when CDU politicians are presented with that fact, they usually say, well, yeah, we can have a maximum price, but where that maximum price would be is actually under the abatement costs, and so that means that you would constantly print additional allowances to kind of keep that maximum price. Yeah, it's getting complicated now, but that essentially means that what you're ending up with is a bad CO2 tax rather than a trading system that takes advantage of the flexibilities. Exactly, that's my take on the options currently on the table. In September, the cabinet is to make a decision what option to go for. I could also imagine in-between versions here that may sound like an ETS, but are actually a tax. Let's see what happens. And the last very important statement that I want to make, I don't have much more time to go into this in detail, is one key argument that's always brought forward in the debate is the question on what about the negative social effects? How can we make sure that the poor are not disproportionately affected by a new carbon price? And it is true, a carbon price in principle, without any accompanying measures, is usually socially regressive. So it's the poor harder than the rich because they are paying proportionately more for fuel and for heating. But you can address that very effectively by redistributing the carbon pricing revenues. And there's different ways of doing that are being discussed. They have also been tried and tested in other countries. So again, the argument of saying, well, we are hitting the poor so much harder, I would say is an evasive argument, because through smart policy design, you can address these issues. And that's also what is currently being planned. So essentially the plan for BMU is to redistribute the revenues through a tax, through a climate premium that would essentially be paid out per head. Yeah, last but not least, last 3 slides of my presentation. So is all we need to do put a price on carbon? Sadly not. But I mean, I wanted to put it there to kind of construct the case in an argumentative way. You could argue yes, because the CO2 price is the most effective instrument. You're not intervening in the market, you're not setting certain winners, you're not betting on who will be the winners in terms of technologies. And it allows, at least ETS, allows control over the absolute emissions and guarantees that the climate budget is kept. And also an argument that's often put forward is, well, if I have that cap, anything that happens under that cap, for instance, renewable support, doesn't lead to additional emission reductions, but only increases the price of mitigation. But I would argue it's very legitimate that there's different goals also within climate policy. For instance, renewable policies do not just aim at reducing emissions, but have the target of pushing through technologies to maturity and to lower prices. So in that case are very much warranted. If you have overlap in policy, this also provides a safety net. If one policy is not particularly effective, it's great that you have other policies in place. Again, taking the example of the EU, we had EU ETS, but actually most of the work in terms of emission reductions has been done by renewables policies. And last but not least, you need those flanking measures to address market failures, barriers, and imperfections, which are there. We are just not, it's not a perfect market. And even less so in developing countries where they're now thinking about carbon pricing than in the European market. And also happy to discuss that. It's also important to say that when you have that picture, okay, we will need to be dealing with a policy mix. A carbon price can still play different roles. The EU ETS was designed to be the central pillar of climate policy with a few flanking measures. I would argue that now this is actually shifting also towards more of a one instrument amongst other instruments. In other countries, this was from the outset designed in a different way. California designed its emissions trading system, which I think is the most robust and strongest and strictest in the world, as a backstop to other policies that essentially at the moment only kicks in when other policies have done their work. This will probably change going forward, but that was at least the initial conception. So there's different. You need to think about these policy actions very carefully. You need to think about them before you introduce your system, and you need to evaluate afterwards, okay, what was actually the effect of these different policies. the cap in an ETS needs to account for assumptions or needs to include robust assumptions on what impacts what other instruments have. And, well, it helps if different instruments have different goals and if you're not kind of slapping 3 or 4 instruments on the same goal, which is also the case in some countries, and then it gets really a little bit messy. This slide is actually an English slide, something for those that couldn't read anything so far, or not so much at least. Shows the abatement costs on the y-axis and the role of different instruments. And this is really where most people agree carbon pricing can do a lot, is namely to drive the relatively moderate cost emission reductions across a broad section of the economy. But that still means you will need policies that correct for market or regulatory failures in prices where even costs are negative, such as energy efficiency. And you will need investments, and R&D particularly, to make sure that the very high-end cost options, that the shape of the abatement cost curve there will change over time. Exactly. You need a package. Which brings me to my final 5 points, which I hope you'll remember at least 3 of. A CO2 price is indispensable for effective climate protection, especially as we are increasing ambition over time, as mandated by the Paris Agreement. What instrument to implement really depends on the context, and we can discuss that further, but I mean, essentially in many lower governance contexts, a carbon tax is probably the more feasible and realistic and simple instrument to start out with. Overall, we do have a global trend towards carbon pricing, but as you've seen, there's a lot of cheap carbon pricing still going on as well, so we need to both expand the share of carbon pricing in terms of global emissions, and we need to ramp up these prices over time. I didn't go into much detail on that, but that's essentially that point on social impacts. If you are creating an instrument that generates meaningful revenue, that revenue can be used very effectively to cushion against negative impacts. And last but not least, the CO2 price alone will not solve it. What you need is a smart instrument mix. Thanks very much.